Mr Quilty to move his notice of motion.
I so move.
And speak.
Thank you, Deputy President. I contemplated breaking my rule today and speaking at length on this motion. If David were here, I'm sure he would have covered things in much more detail. However, in the last 2 years, I've already raised all the issues we will be discussing today. There's far too much waffle and hot air produced in this place that no one ever listens to, and so, as usual, I'll be reasonably brief. The last 2 years have been dominated by the use of emergency powers. We've been banned from leaving our homes, banned from working, banned from re-entering the state, banned from protesting, forced to wear masks, forced to report our movements, forced to take vaccinations. The government deployed hundreds of riot police to break up protests. They fired rubber bullets and pepper spray into crowds. They intimidated people in their homes and made arrests based on social media posts. The government took control of our lives using emergency powers legislation. 2 years on, the government still refuses to give up that power. At no stage did the government try voluntary compliance. Having the big stick of emergency powers in their hand, they went straight to compulsion and force every time. The government extended the initial 6-month cap on the use of emergency powers, then extended it a second time, and then removed the cap altogether. We are still now subject to these emergency powers. 5% of the Victorian population is still being locked out of the economy, in direct opposition to the health advice that we have seen, such as it is. How should this be questioned or brought to account? In theory, there are accountability measures around the use of emergency powers. However, none of these accountability mechanisms have amounted to anything. The reports published by this government show nothing of value about who made decisions, why they were made, and what information was available at the time. For most of the pandemic, the health advice was concealed. The decision-making process was opaque. Was the CHO making the health directives based on the best advice? We know that the human rights of Victorians were disregarded when decisions were being made. The words proportionate and least restrictive very clearly did not factor in the decisions as they should have. We have heard reports from people working in the emergency management team that advice and draft directions were regularly passed through the Premier's office. They were concerned that political priorities interfered with frank and fearless health advice. This is not the way the emergency powers were designed to run. This must be examined in an impartial process. The inquiry into the hotel quarantine fiasco was buried under a mountain of "I can't recall" statements. The findings of abuse of human rights by the Victorian Ombudsman were swept under the rug and ignored. This pandemic has exposed how vulnerable Victorians are to abuse of government power. Our emergency powers need proper safeguards to protect Victorians from their government during an emergency. Putting to one side the human rights aspect of the pandemic response, there remains the question of whether the measures taken under the emergency powers were appropriate, whether, over both the short run and the long run, they improved the health of Victorians, or whether, in the long run, more lives will be lost. We know, in retrospect, that many measures taken under the emergency powers did not improve health outcomes. Locking people in their houses in the early stages of the pandemic, then limiting outside exercise, was probably counterproductive from a health perspective. Many measures taken during the pandemic are having long-term impacts on the physical and mental health of Victorians. It seems likely that the long-term health costs of the response will dwarf the actual health impacts of the pandemic. Just the reduction in physical exercise, the pandemic weight gains will be an anchor around the necks of Victorians into the future. Alcohol consumption rocketed during the pandemic and has not dropped back to pre-pandemic levels. Other medical issues were ignored when they should have been treated, and mental health issues have spiked across age groups and across the state. A clear example of the breakdown of process that should be examined is the treatment of children throughout the pandemic. Mounting evidence is suggesting that there have been significant impacts on children. higher numbers of students refusing to attend class, a devastating burden on mental health that has impacted many Victorians, but particularly children and teenagers. And just today we have reporting that technology used for remote learning may have systematically breached the privacy of students. All of this for a virus that presents less risk to young people than the current strain of influenza that's circulating. In addition to the questions about whether this was an appropriate response, there are questions of process that need to be examined. How were the benefits and harms assessed? How robust were human rights considerations? Any restrictions are supposed to be proportionate and the least restrictive of human rights. Who made the call? What advice did they act on? And what was the process for doing so? Victorians deserve answers any future government needs to understand so that we can avoid making the same mistakes in any future crisis. But we will not know if we do not look clearly and closely at this. I have not even touched on the economic costs of the use of emergency powers. The billions of dollars in debt, the small businesses crushed, the lives and dreams crushed. The economy is not just some abstract economic figure. It's the sum of all human activity, all the effort and striving, the dreams and hopes of the people. 2 years of our lives and so much more of our future gone. It's clear that I believe that the way this pandemic was handled by the Andrews government is not a model to be replicated. But even if you think things were largely managed well, there remain many lessons to be learned and improvements to be made. And I have zero faith in any review that is not entirely independent of this government will actually produce an honest, dispassionate analysis of the pandemic response, as we've seen all too often when the government investigates themselves. That is why I'm calling for a Royal Commission to investigate the use of emergency powers. A Royal Commission will be able to untangle the mess that is the last 2 years of dictatorial government control. It will expose the problems and reveal where reforms are needed. And no doubt, it will also identify what has been done right. If the government thinks they have done well, they should have no reason to fear an investigation. They should welcome this review. It's not about a witch hunt or finger-pointing. It's about finding truth. Victorians deserve to understand why their lives have been upended for the last 2 years. Victorians need to know what worked and what did not work, what was justified and what was not. If we do not examine properly what happened, if we allow spin and cover-ups to conceal what really happened, we'll be doomed to repeat mistakes and probably worsen them. We must look at this, really look at it, so that we can do better next time.